Hello, and welcome to this virtual event celebrating a new book by Chris Bohjalian. I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi. If you don't know about us, we are a nonprofit organization that champions contemporary literature in a variety of ways. Foremost among those is our quarterly print magazine of reviews, interviews, and essays. That was our current issue I held up, and if you would like to hold it too, we would love to mail you a copy. Check out our website anytime after tonight's event to see if you might be interested in joining our circle of readers. Another way we advocate for literature is through events like this one. And tonight's event, like most of ours, is free to attend, but if you're able to pitch in a little something, please feel free to use the donate button at the bottom of your screen. As a nonprofit organization, Rain Taxi is proud to receive funding from places like the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, but our most vital supporters are individual readers like you. There are many other ways you can participate on your screen tonight as well. There's the chat, of course. So many of you are already chiming in. Keep it coming. If you have a question, you can put that in the Ask a Question box, and we'll get to some of those at toward the end of the conversation tonight. And then, of course, you can buy the book using that button on your screen. When you do that, it'll take you right to the ordering page for Hour of the Witch at Valley Bookseller in beautiful Stillwater, Minnesota. You'll be getting a signed copy of the book, too, so make sure you take advantage of that. Tonight's presentation of Chris Bohjalian in conversation with Sheila O'Connor is co-sponsored by Rain Taxi and another great reading series based here in the Twin Cities called Literature Lovers Night Out. To introduce Chris and Sheila, it's my pleasure to turn the virtual microphone over to the host of Literature Lovers Night Out, Pamela Klingerhorn.
Thank you so much, Eric. As Eric said, I'm Pamela Klingerhorn from the Literature Lovers Night Out program and Valley Bookseller. I'm so thrilled to be part of this extraordinary event tonight with Rain Taxi, with whom I've been affiliated for over 10 years, and the gorgeous independent bookstore Valley Bookseller in Stillwater, Minnesota. Today is the culmination of a long personal quest. Several years ago, a loyal Literature Lovers Night Out customer asked me which author I would most like to host at the program. My answer was that while there were many authors I would like to host, my crusade had become Chris Bohjalian. Today, with Rain Taxi, I have attained the Holy Grail. I have been a huge fan of Chris's work ever since the publication of Midwives, which became one of Oprah's first book club selections. Many of you will know Chris from his many best-selling novels, such as Transistor Radio, Before You Know Kindness, The Double Bind, his recent book, The Red Lotus, and The Flight Attendant, which is now a Golden Globe-winning HBO series. His newly released Hour of the Witch is a historical thriller set in 1662, which may also be Chris's most timely novel of all. He constantly reinvents himself. He tackles new genres with each novel. The common denominator among Chris's titles is that he knows how to write strong female characters. He's successfully written family dramas, mysteries, thrillers, and historical fiction. Having read his entire body of work, I can endorse all of them. They're excellent reading material, great for book club discussions, and they make superb gifts. Imagine the delight of a recipient upon opening a signed first edition of Hour of the Witch from our host store, Valley Bookseller. Tonight, it's my honor to welcome Chris Bohjalian to the virtual stage at Rain Taxi. He's going to be in conversation with one of our beloved Minnesota literary luminaries, Sheila O'Connor. Sheila is the author of 6 novels. Her most recent work of historical fiction is called Evidence of V, a novel in fragments, facts, and fictions, and it won the Minnesota Book Award. Sheila is also a recipient of the Michigan Prize for Literary Fiction, a Midwest Booksellers Award, and was selected as one of Barnes & Noble's Great New Writers. Sheila O'Connor is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and is currently a professor of creative writing at the Hamline University program, where she serves as fiction editor for the Waterstone Review. Thank you to Sheila for so generously sharing her time tonight to facilitate this conversation. I have no doubt it's going to be fascinating. Whether this is your first Chris Bohjalian novel or your 22nd, Hour of the Witch is a mesmerizing read. Diana Gabaldon recently gave Hour of the Witch a glowing review in the Washington Post, and I just want to end with this quotation. Bohjalian is not only a talented storyteller, he understands women, and it shows in the insightful and empathetic way in which he tells his stories. Historical fiction lives and dies by the details. The specifics are handled with great skill and delicacy. The book is a thriller in structure and a real page-turner, the ending both unexpected and satisfying. Without further ado, let's all put our hands together and give a big virtual round of applause for Chris Bohjalian and Sheila O'Connor. Thank you so much.
First of all, I've got to give a huge shout out to Sheila because Evidence of Thee just left me gobsmacked. This book is fantastic. It is so brilliant, so deft, so wrenching, so surprising. And the use of poetry and photographs just put it in another league. So Sheila, I love sharing the days with you. Pamela, thank you so much for making this happen. I'm a huge fan of Pamela, not simply because of her great work as a literary advocate, not simply because she's a great friend, but because she taught me one of the most important things ever. If you want to get a great shot of your dog in a book, you gotta put the cheese on the head. So Pamela, thank you for making that happen. I love posing with cheese on my head with my beloved Jessie. And Eric, thank you for, well, all you do at Rain Taxi. And so I bow before the three of you.
Oh, Chris, thank you. It's really kind words. Yeah, I mean, the minute I went to entered this book, I thought of how much our work had in common in terms of taking up themes to do with women and the legal system.
And injustice.
And injustice, yeah. So I wanted to just start and just kick off with that right away. The book is set in 1662, and I wondered if you'd begin by talking a bit about what draws you to historical fiction, the pleasures and the challenges of writing it.
Yeah. You know, I've written 4 novels of the 22 that are historical fiction. This one had its origins going back a lot of years. I've always been fascinated by Puritan theology, going back to college. Imagine living in a world where Satan is as real as your neighbor. Imagine living in a world where you wonder constantly, am I saved or am I damned? Now, when we think of witchcraft in America, we always go right to 1692 and Salem. But 30 years before Salem, in 1662, Hartford was hanging witches. In 1656, the governor of Massachusetts had his own sister-in-law hanged as a witch. So I was thinking to myself, what is my way in? And I came across an obscure 3-line reference in Boston's Court of Assistants from 1672. Elizabeth Nanny Naylor successfully sued her husband for divorce on the grounds of cruelty. So I went down the Puritan divorce rabbit hole. and I learned that in the 17th century, 31 Puritan couples divorced. And there were 5 reasons why you could divorce: polygamy, desertion, adultery, and you will love this when you think of the Puritans, impotence, and cruelty. Of those 31 divorces, 29 were for polygamy, desertion, and adultery. Only 1 was for cruelty. And the more I learned about this divorce, the more I thought to myself, who was this woman who, 350 years before hashtag I believe her, stood before the all-male court of assistants, 14 men in black robes, and said, my marriage is toxic. I am married to a beast. I want out. And that was my way in. Now, my novel has two parts. Part one is the book of the wife. Part two is the book of the witch. Because it was really clear when I was writing this book that what began as a civil divorce trial would quickly become a witch hunt. So the book was inspired as well by America's first witch hunt that preceded Salem by 30 years.
The book takes up this question of he said, she said. I mean, that's so much the first part of the book, but then it also fuels the book of the witch, so both of these are part of it. And this has to do with the litigation of assault survivors, domestic assault survivors when they're women, domestic sexual assault survivors as women. And for me, reading the book, I found both the absence of proof, and Mary's inability to prove what had been done to her, and the attack on her character for bringing the charges to be one of the most terrifying aspects of the book. I mean, it just held me in terror throughout the entire story. And I'm wondering if, as you worked on this, I feel certain you saw the way that this is playing out still today, but also if you look to a time in which this paradigm might be different than it was in 1662, and then it remains today.
Oh, when I was writing this novel, I knew it was weirdly timely.
Yeah.
I mean, when one of the men on the Court of Assistants says to Mary Deerfield, "You are a nasty woman," I
Yes.
knew the reference would not be lost on contemporary readers. And I love a courtroom drama. And so
but they're so frightening.
and in this case, yes, I knew that this was going to be unnerving, simply because of, as you put it, the he said, she said notion of domestic violence. The first scene in the first chapter is Mary Deerfield on a Sunday morning adjusting her coif before church to make sure that no one can see the bruises. Because, and she wonders, Mary Deerfield is 1 foot in 1662, but I hope 1 foot in 2021. Mary Deerfield at one point asks herself, how is it I am feeling humiliation?
Right.
How is it I am feeling degradation? I have done nothing wrong. And yet, there she is, hiding the bruises beneath her coif.
And women are still hiding their bruises. And one of the things that comes up when women step forward, when there's been any kind of a time delay, people say, who did you tell? Why didn't you tell anyone when it occurred? And this same thing is happening in the trial in 1662. Who did you tell? Did you tell your parents? Why didn't you tell them? And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, this line of questioning is too familiar. It just keeps repeating itself.
One of my friends is a victim's advocate for women who are in toxic marriages or relationships and are getting out. And whenever I would talk to her about this book, and the courtroom issues that a woman in 2021 would face. And then I would look back at the depositions from the 17th century. I would see how little has changed. The Puritans didn't have court stenographers, but they took depositions. They interviewed quote unquote witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And so the record they've left behind is chilling for two reasons. One, because of what these women endured, but also because of how friggin' little has changed.
Yes. Yeah.
It's mind-numbing.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the other thing that is so interesting to me is that if you wanted to be hanged as a witch, you needed to be smart, strong,
Mm-hmm.
opinionated, and female.
Mm-hmm.
That's what would get you hanged.
Mm-hmm.
And how interesting was it just a couple of weeks ago when some Michigan legislators wanted to pillory the governor of Michigan by calling her a witch? I mean, the word has so much baggage.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, you have the old crone in the woods with a wart on her nose who boils children. And then you have the highly eroticized young woman, you know, think Samantha Stevens in Bewitched. But what do these two tropes have in common? Unbelievably threatening to men.
Mm-hmm. Autonomy. Female autonomy.
Yep. Living alone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep. One of
ability to
Mary
act on
Deerfield's
your own.
one of Mary Deerfield's older friends in the novel is a woman named Constance Winston.
Mm-hmm. She's great.
Who lives alone. Thank you. Who lives alone but for her servant girl, which makes her immediately suspicious.
Mm.
I mean, Puritan theology was clear. Man has dominion over animals, and husband has dominion over wife.
One of the things that you did in the book that was so interesting to me, because of course it's told through Mary's point of view, and even though she is our protagonist and she's a sympathetic protagonist, and I aligned with her in so many ways, I thought her belief in Satan and in salvation and in ending up going to hell, you never veered from the fact that she actually believed in these things. And I thought that was so powerful, and also transporting as a reader, because I stayed within that psyche throughout the book. I looked at it through Mary's eyes throughout the entire story. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about writing, a woman in 1662 who is a victim of domestic assault, and writing that from a contemporary male perspective. And just what I often think of with writers is this kind of Venn diagram where there's a part of us that crosses over the characters in ways that allow us to enter into these experiences. So I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Okay.
We have to move in and out of all kinds of people. And there's a part of us that has to understand everyone in order to move in and out of them. You have to understand the abusive husband. You have to understand the woman in the woods who's also considered a witch. You have to understand the gossips who are bringing Mary down. So just to begin with, talking about Mary, your ability to kind of imagine that, and maybe even the work that you do when you're entering into a character who is dissimilar from yourself.
Yeah. Those are great questions, and they get at so much of what you and I do. One of Mary Deerfield's principal inspirations was America's first European-born immigrant poet, Anne Bradstreet.
Yes, yes, that's right.
I mean, among the muses for me have been Anne Bradstreet, Emily Dickinson, Mary Oliver, Rita Dove. But the thing I love about Anne Bradstreet's poetry is it reminds us that the Puritans had internal lives as complex as ours. Her poetry is beautiful. You know, it chronicles her grief at the death of a grandchild, her sorrow when her entire library of books burns to the ground, her deep, passionate love for her husband, and her occasional doubts about God and Satan. And yet, she was one of Boston's premier saints and worthies. So she was a very important influence. But there were others. The Puritans were avid diarists. They were constantly keeping ledgers. They were the most anxious people around because here was the catch-22 of predestination. You're either saved or damned.
Mm-hmm.
And if you begin to believe you're saved because you live a life of good works,
You're damned.
well, you're damned because that is the sin of hubris.
Right.
I am so anxious. I am so filled with self-loathing and anxiety that, I would have made a hell of a Puritan.
Oh, so now we've hit the Venn diagram piece of it.
Well, I mean, yes, and go back to the Venn diagram.
Well, no, that's interesting. So you, with your anxiety, you could connect with Mary's anxiety, Mary's fear. Yeah,
I could, and I will never forget. In 2011, when my father was dying, and he took a really, really long time to die, for about a year. Every 3 weeks, I was flying from Vermont to Florida to spend 4 or 5 days, check in with him and his doctors. And I remember at one point, his younger sister, my aunt, gave me this big hug and said, "God, Chris, thank God you're the daughter my brother never had."
Oh, and then we have this in common, since I'm the son my father never had.
There's the diagram.
I'd like to know about how many novelists have this going on too, in their ability to kind of imagine all of these lives. So do you have, like, when you were working on this book in particular, I guess, did you have an ideal reader? Do you have somebody on the other side of this story in the months and the years that you spend, like, so exquisitely crafting this novel? Do you have someone you're talking to? And I'm going to take that even one step further, which is, did you feel the reader was on Mary's side? Or did you feel like you were in conversation with people who may have doubted Mary or judged Mary?
Yeah. I am known well for writing messy women.
Mm.
As my daughter once said to me, and she's narrated all her parts of 5 of my audiobooks. She once said to me, "Dad, take this as a compliment, because I mean it that way, but I think your sweet spot as a writer is seriously messed up young women."
Mm.
And she's right. Think Cassie Bowden in The Flight Attendant,
Mm-hmm.
Emily Shepard in Close Your Eyes, Hold Hands, all those women who survived the Armenian genocide in the Sandcastle Girls, Karine, Nevart, Hatun. But Mary Deerfield is a little different. Mary Deerfield, I don't believe is messed up. I believe Mary Deerfield is a woman of her age.
Yeah.
Who believes in Satan and Jesus Christ as people who literally are present with her, who worries about the woods,
Mm-hmm.
who believes in demonic possession, but is also smart enough to know, I will not live if I am in this marriage. I need to risk everything. And she knows this. I have pride, and not pride in a sinful way. Pride in a way that the Lord God did not make me to be a doormat.
Yeah.
I mean,
I love that.
Okay.
I love that.
One of the,
Chris.
thank you. I mean, one of the footnotes to this book that is critical to this book is that the Puritans had atrocious table manners. First of all, they drank beer like it's spring break in Miami. Secondly,
I did notice beer was getting served at every meal. I had a real education in this book, but yeah.
They drank some, yeah. Secondly, they did have plates, but most of the time they were eating out of trenchers or long rectangular pig troughs for humans that 2 or 3 people would share. 3, they didn't use forks because they viewed the 3-tined fork that was coming into vogue in Europe as too reminiscent of the devil's pitchfork.
Yes.
The devil's tines. So basically you've got a bunch of drunk Puritans eating with their hands, not using forks. And that would become important in the book because this would become possibly an implement in a spell that someone is casting around Mary Deerfield. Someone is burying forks in her yard. And of course, the fork would be the last straw when, and this isn't a spoiler alert, Mary's husband would take a fork and, plunge it into the back of her hand.
And Mary, even though she will at times, say she understands that the fork is not an instrument of Satan, she also has her doubts about it. That's what's so interesting about it. And all this energy around the fork. I mean, the fact that a fork having
Right.
evil powers could fuel a book forward was unbelievable to me. And that leads me to something else I wanted to ask you about. So the book, which is meticulously, obviously researched and has what the Washington Post called unfolds through these lavish details, and lavish is the exact word for it. I think that was from the Washington Post. But I think any reader to this book who's unfamiliar with the Puritans, as I was, will get an education in domestic law, commerce, medicine, fertility, beliefs about witchcraft, women, and even cutlery. Were there things in your research that particularly surprised you? Like, how did you even come upon this fork business?
Yep. I came across this fork business when I came across an essay that talked about the earliest forks found in archaeological digs in the 18th century. There were no forks found in the 17th century in New England. So I did a deep dive into Puritan table manners and learned that even in Europe, it wasn't until the mid to late 1600s that people began using forks in the Netherlands and in France. But in New England, Good heavens, no, not the devil's times.
The devil's time.
I just found that unbelievably interesting. I found it interesting that they didn't have coat hangers. You know, they'd come in from the cold and they'd hang their cloaks and their coats on pegs. I just, they didn't have closets. Most Puritan homes, even the ones with second floors, didn't have stairs. They had ladders. These details just fascinated me. And yet, Boston in the 1660s, on the one hand, you've got this thriving, burgeoning city. The docks are a madhouse as the boats are coming from the West Indies and Europe. But then you leave the city for the woods and you have two things. The indigenous people, who on the one hand, the Puritans looked down upon, heathen. On the other hand, they were scared to death of them. And secondly, you have, and I don't want to, paraphrase Dana Carvey and Church Lady, but you have Satan. The woods were terrifying.
Yeah. So the book is filled with plenty of terror. Some of it coming from nothing more than forks. Some of it coming from the way that suspicion and myth can take over and fuel a narrative. But there also is in the book, before we move on from this, because there is a lot of darkness, but there also is this incredible kind of testament to, and you touched on it, Mary Deerfield's spirit and what we have that sustains us, or what one young woman has that sustains her, and also a testament to friendship and love and kindness in the midst of all kinds of cruelty. And I guess I just wanted to ask, is this something that you just kind of hold in your heart as a writer when you're even in the midst of these dark narratives?
Dread.
Looking for light?
Dread is my stock in trade. But I think it's often leavened by decency. And that's the tightrope that you and I walk as writers. Dread and decency. Heartbreak and hope. I mean, Aristotle talked a lot about what's the perfect ending. And the perfect ending is utterly surprising. You say, I didn't see that coming. But then you take a step back and you say, but it couldn't have ended any other way. So in Mary Deerfield's story, you got a lot of dread and a lot of darkness. But yeah, I mean, she has her friends, some turn against her, some don't. She has her mother and father who love her and are deeply concerned for her. And this is important because it's 1662. She has her faith. I mean, there are moments in the book when, just as Satan is scaring her, Jesus Christ is giving her comfort. Just as her husband is, well, the devil incarnate, she has one or two friends who are just angelic. And it's I think, an indication of dread and how important dread is in my work, that even those friends, I think you begin to wonder about midway through the book.
Yes. So this has been a fabulous conversation, and I could talk with you all night about this book. I see that we didn't even scratch the surface of all I wanted to discuss. But
And I want to talk with you so much about this. Oh my gosh.
we're going to finally, when all of this time is over, we're going to meet somewhere and we're going to have a long conversation about all of this. But I wanted to
we're going to watch your son and my daughter on consecutive nights
act somewhere
on shows in New York City.
They'll be back acting. That'll be fabulous. I wanted to leave a minute for just a few minutes, actually, for audience questions, because I know they're coming in and I think that Pamela is fielding them for us. So
thanks, Pamela.
I think Eric's actually on the job here.
Hey, Eric. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, we divide all the labor up. Thank you both. What a great conversation, and I hope we all get to eavesdrop when you have that longer conversation, because it's a pleasure to listen to you. We do have a handful of questions, or I'm going to say a forkful of questions tonight.
Oh no, Eric, I'd rather you didn't.
And some of them are about process, especially as it comes to historical fiction, which I think does maybe, well, I guess we'll learn. Maybe there are some different elements to the process, but some of the questions center around how do you start when you're working with history? Do you go to the sources first? Do you work with your imagination first? And as a side note, how do you stop? When do you veer from the truth when it doesn't suit your purpose?
Okay,
I have a similar question for Chris, so I'm dying to hear.
Okay, I'm going to answer, but then I want to actually send it to Sheila, because our historical process, what Sheila did with Evidence of V is groundbreaking. It's just so interesting. So Hour of the Witch. I spent a few weeks, maybe 3 or 4, making sure that the idea was viable. Courtroom drama set in 1662 about a divorce trial that may edge into a witch trial. And once I'd done 3 or 4 weeks of research, I determined, yeah, it's viable. I can't interview anyone who was there, but the sources exist. If you look at the back of Hour of the Witch, you will see a very long list of sources I used. My Puritan library is massive. I've got all of the books I had in college, along with my Russian literature books. They're the only books I kept. No, I also kept my Fitzgerald books. And I need to note that in Minnesota.
Yes.
But those are among the only books that I kept. But my library grew and grew and grew. And I had the great privilege of meeting a guy named L. Kinvin Roth, president and dean emeritus at Vermont Law School, who happens to be one of the nation's premier scholars in Puritan litigation. Whenever he had a question, he would instantly say, okay, you need to go to the Boston Public Library online source here, or you need to go to the Colonial Society of America and look at these articles, or I believe so-and-so has written about such and such. And then there were so many great books about women and the perception of witchcraft. My favorite being, and bonus points alone for the title, Carol Carlson's The Devil in the Shape of a Woman. Now, I want to throw the question back at Sheila, because what you did in Evidence of V is extraordinary.
Thank you.
In terms of research and the book.
Thank you. Well, when I was reading this book of yours, I saw in the afterword that you had brought this idea up to somebody 20 years ago. So I had about that same length of time with Evidence of V, about 20 years, before I actually got busy writing the book, from when I first had the idea of it. And I researched and researched and researched, and then I started writing, and then I went back and forth with the research. But I'm trusting you didn't research for 20 years. because you're a busy writer, and I didn't research straight for 20 years either. So what was on that topic of process and research? How did you move from the research into the novel? And was there a point in which that happened?
I started writing the book in 2001. And
Oh,
I was
you really
thriving.
start writing it then?
Yeah, I was thriving. The book was motoring along. Then on 9/11, in the morning when the towers collapsed, I was on a runway in Denver on a book tour. Obviously, the book tour stopped. I'd be stranded in Denver for 8 days. And rather than watch images of a plane going into 2 World Trade Tower over and over, I wrote and wrote and wrote. My wife used to work on the 104th floor. I got back to Vermont and I couldn't write the book. I was too depressed. Every moment brought me back to being alone in a hotel room in Denver, far from my wife and daughter. So I wrote something completely different, a book set in the present. And I never, ever thought I would go back to this. I went back to this book when I finished writing a book called The Red Lotus. And I was wondering what comes next. And I was feeling a hankering to write historical fiction. And my wife and I had recently moved. And I came across the first 80 pages of what I was calling then The Trials of Mary Deerfield. And I read it and thought, I'm not depressed anymore. I'm invigorated. This book is important now. I mean, it wasn't that long since when I rediscovered the manuscript, the Women's March in January 2017.
Mm-hmm.
And I was writing a lot of this book during the Brett Kavanaugh hearing.
Yeah.
And I was invigorated and inspired and happy. I felt it was one of those books that's a legacy book for me that makes a difference.
That's a really powerful story, Chris. I think, these times in our lives, I shelved a book at that time too. And just thinking of the way that there's times that we can't write a book, even as close as we are to it. And as, in love with the ideas we are, it just isn't right. And then to know that it came back at another time when you had something you were really ready to say, that's very moving.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you.
It is indeed. And like so many good conversationalists, you've answered some other questions that were in the queue just by virtue of exploring that one and taking us down that path. But we had some people really interested in how do you keep things straight when you're working on more than one project at a time, for example, and that beautiful explanation of instinct and saving those drafts, not letting them expire, is, I think, going to be inspiring to many writers in the audience. We are.
I've never Gorky'd a manuscript. I've written some terrible manuscripts, but I've never burned one.
Hard to believe they're that terrible. But Pamela, any last words from you?
I just want to say thank you so much to Chris for sharing his time with us this evening to present this wonderful novel. I just couldn't have been more honored to host you this evening, Chris. Thank you. And Sheila, my dear friend, congratulations on Evidence of V. You know how much I love that book, and I just couldn't imagine a better conversation partner for Chris. So thank you both for
putting us together
tonight. And I hope everyone will hit 2 buttons tonight: one to donate to Rain Taxi so we can keep the gas in the tank, and one to Valley Booksellers to buy the book tonight, because you want a first edition signed by Chris Bohjalian.
Thank you.
And thank you. And before I say goodnight, first of all, Eric, Rain Taxi, thank you for all you do. Sheila, thank you for, well, joining me for tonight and for Evidence of V, which is just bloody friggin' fantastic. Pamela, thank you for the great gift of friendship all these years and for, so many lovely conversations and drinks about books going back to, I think, 2011 and The Night Strangers. Valley Booksellers, I just want to thank you because, if you'd said to me 15 months ago, by the time this was over, we would have lost the equivalent of people of the state of Vermont, I think my knees would have buckled. But we will. And booksellers like Valley Booksellers, you were frontline workers who helped keep us sane. Whether it was with curbside deliveries, pickups, drop-offs, safely reopening, you brought us stories. And so I just want to thank Pamela, Eric, Sheila, and Valley Booksellers, and all of you who are watching. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Chris. What a great final word to our audience out there. We hope you've had a good time. Thanks so much. Good night.